Okay, folks, we are going to move on to American rationalism for our next era of American literature. So I'm going to share these notes with you. For the record, I did not make these notes, but I find them very funny, which is why I chose to stick with them instead of making my own. Not very funny. That's an overstatement, but they give me a little chuckle. So what we're looking at here, after we move out of the Puritan era, we're looking at 1750 to 1800. This is not a very long time period that we're dealing with, and we'll move through it pretty quickly because just between you and me, what's coming up next is a lot more fun. Rationalism is not the most thrilling reading in the world, but what I've picked for us to read is pretty good. Okay, so rationalism, you can probably tell by the root of the word rational. It's the belief that human beings can arrive at truth by using reason rather than by relying on the authority of the past or religious faith or intuition. This is also sometimes called the age of reason. So obviously, I think I've mentioned this before, each time period that crops up in American literature or in other countries' literature too, this is the same thing for British literature, which will take next year. Each new era of American literature is kind of reacting to the era that came before it. And they're kind of butting heads with the ideals that they were sort of brought up to believe. And, you know, I feel like this is still a very relevant concept because a lot of young people now don't necessarily agree with the things that their parents believed. They kind of fight back against those ideals, and those people they have always kind of fought back against the ideals that were conveyed to them through their parents. And so we're dealing with like a wider span of time than just like from grandparent to parent to kid, but it's the same concept. Whatever you're kind of brought up believing, it's sort of second nature to rebel against that, and we can see that in the eras of literature. So whereas Puritanism, as we know, was very like staunchly religious, very regimented, very sort of closed off with emotions, while I wouldn't say rationalism is super emotional, they rely so much more on reason than faith, which is why it's called the Age of Reason. So like I said, this is sort of a reaction against Puritanism. By the end of the 17th century, reason began to present a challenge to the unshakable faith of the Puritans. When faced with all of these huge decisions that we know people were making because of what they believed in, because of their religious or moral beliefs, sooner or later people start coming in and thinking like, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like there's not a lot of logic to it. And I mean, that's true. People don't have faith because it's logical. They have faith because that's what they believe in and because that's what they feel. There's not a lot of logic in faith. There doesn't have to be. But when you're trying to sort of rebel against the ideals that came before you, if the ideals that came before you were very faith-based, it only makes sense that your reaction is going to be very rational. Plus, look at that Puritan man, my goodness. And in the Puritans, as we know, really thought that only one of two things were going to happen to you. You're either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell. And the way that you lived determined that. Rationalism says there are so many futures for us to consider. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen after death. And it's not like everybody stopped being religious at all. That's not the case, but they just have a lot more rationality to it and start to consider there are a lot of different ways we could live. We don't necessarily have to adhere to all these strict rules that we've been brought up to believe. So like I was saying, reason and logic obviously become more important than faith and religion. We didn't learn about Anselm, and we're not going to learn about Descartes, but because they're not American. But these two quotes kind of go hand in hand, or I guess the opposite of hand in hand. This guy before, around the Puritan era, was thinking, what his sort of philosophy was, I believe so that I might understand, which kind of goes against logic. You think you would understand a thing before you believe it, but that's not his philosophy. Descartes, now in the age of reason, says, I think, therefore I am. Rational thought is the basis for everything. Look at that. I pink, therefore I am. Love it. Look at that mad looking cow in the back. Is he scolding that chicken? So Thomas Jefferson's Bible, he wrote this. Thomas Jefferson, we all know him. He wrote this book, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. He sort of changed parts of the Bible to create a new version, particularly the parts that tell the life of Jesus. And he removed all the references to anything supernatural happening, miracles, angels, the divinity and resurrection of Jesus. He basically made a totally logical, believable version of the Bible, something that we don't have to like question, because it could absolutely happen. He wanted a Bible that showed Jesus as a great moral teacher, but nothing more. And obviously that's sort of problematic, because if you are a Christian, you certainly believe that he was more than just a great moral teacher. Most people agree that Jesus was a dude, like he existed, but there are plenty of people who think that he was the Son of God, and there are plenty of people who think that he was just a great moral teacher, but there was nothing divine about him. So this is, as I mentioned, often called the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment. There's less focus during this time on hell or life after death. There's more concern with creating a better life on earth, which of course is logical, because we don't actually know logically what will happen after we die. You may have a system of beliefs, but obviously there's no situation where somebody can actually like come back and tell you, hey, this is what happens. It's all based on faith. So since we're not really basing our beliefs on faith in the Age of Reason, it only stands to reason that we should make the most of the life that we have. And since we are in the present moment, let's try to create this better life on earth. And Thomas Paine is a very famous writer from this era, and he wrote a thing called The Age of Reason, an essay, a pamphlet, something like that. And he said, I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. It's a hope. It's not for sure. So they also believed that God's gift to humanity was reason. That sounds logical to me. The ability to think in an ordered, logical manner enabled people to discover both scientific and spiritual truth. And I'm sure that kind of helped establish the spiritual beliefs of the day. There's definitely something that separates humans from other animals, and one of the major things is reason. We have a much greater capacity to reason than other animals do. Not that no animals have any capacity to reason. We know that that's not true. But we certainly have the greatest capacity to reason. Reason and free inquiry, meaning the ability to question anything, are the natural enemies of error and of error only. So if you have reason and you ask questions, you try to get to the bottom of things, then you're unlikely to make as many errors as you would if you were just going into things blindly. Thomas Jefferson wrote that. So unlike the Puritans, rationalists believed that people were able to perfect themselves through good works and self-effort. For instance, this Ben Franklin looking fella saying that he will not drink 5 Dr. Pepper big gulps today. 5 is a lot. I love Dr. Pepper. I could maybe do 1, a big gulp. It's probably like, what, 32 ounces at least. So as we know, because we have studied the Puritans, that they worked to perfect themselves, but they didn't really believe it was possible. If you guys remember Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Jonathan Edwards said that God was looking down on us as though we were scum, essentially. I mean, I think the comparison he made was like something about a gross spider in its web or something like that. We're horrible and deceitful, and he doesn't really have any reason to love us. But what you have to do if you're a Puritan is live your life with the hope that you can please God, but you probably won't be able to. Rationalists believe that people were able to perfect themselves. If they worked on themselves hard enough, they would have loved self-help books. Oh my gosh. So maybe we're in a little bit more of an age of reason than we are in an age of spirituality. I don't know. That's food for thought. So there is also a scientific explanation for God's existence, according to the rationalists. Sir Isaac Newton, who you may know from, I don't know, science, compared God to a clockmaker. His idea was that the great machine, a human, must have a mechanic or a supreme architect. So he believed that God had essentially crafted us carefully. Deism. Some people say deism. I don't. Do you guys know what that means? Probably. Basically, this is belief in God. Not necessarily. Y'all are probably familiar from social studies with the terms monotheism and polytheism. Deism is just the idea that there is a God. And that God had made it possible for all people at all times to discover natural laws through their God-given power of reason. Oh, I hope that did not just mess up my recording a bit. I had to pause the recording for a second because I had to sneeze very badly. So as I was saying, deism, basically the belief in a supreme being, a God, or many gods, just that there is a more powerful something out there, a being. Reason is kind of our gift from God, and through reason he made it possible for us to discover natural laws. I feel like that was probably repetitive, but that sneeze really threw me off. So deists believed that the universe was orderly and good. Through the use of reason, every human being was perfectible. Is that a word? Perfectible? I mean, it makes sense. They believe that God's objective was the happiness of his creatures, very different from what the Puritans believed. They would have you believe that God didn't really care if you're happy or not. They do believe that there are punishments and rewards after this life. It might not be quite as specific as what the Puritans believed, but they do believe in that. And their faith was a philosophy and a guide for an ethical way of living rather than an organized religious institution. So a lot of people probably wouldn't have necessarily considered themselves Christians, but they might have considered themselves to be good, ethical, moral people who lived by a certain rational code. Deists did not believe in superstition, which we sort of know. The Puritans were very superstitious. They believed in a lot of stuff that, there's not really a lot of reason to. Like if you believe the Bible, which they did, they probably shouldn't have been so superstitious. But that's just me saying that. That's not, that's not in a textbook or anything. I'm just kind of thinking out loud. They didn't believe in the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They did not believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible. They may have believed that it was more intended as like lessons, but that, all of these sort of supernatural things that are in the Bible didn't really occur. They probably would not believe that, for instance, Jonah was actually swallowed by a whale and lived to tell about it. They would probably see that story as a parable of what can we get out of that story. Actually, I'm trying to remember what we get out of that story. It's been a while. Jonah, his whole thing was like he had decided not to do what God told him to do, and he had to be eaten by a whale before he learned that he needs to just follow the Lord. So that would be sort of more of the idea of what deists would think, that that all of these stories in the Bible are sort of just meant as parables. They did not believe that worship required attending a service, that one could worship privately. You know who would take issue with that? You know who would take umbrage, I dare say, with that? Would be Reverend Paris. That's right, Reverend Paris, because we know that he was upset with John because he didn't come to church every week. Well, maybe John was a little bit more of a deist because he didn't think that he had to come to church every week. If you believe in God, then you can worship him anywhere. And, you know, I think certainly John Proctor tried with one major error to live a good life and be considered a good man. Okay, let's move on. I feel like I'm going to get off on a crucible tangent. God gave us reason, not religion. Look at deism.com. I've never visited it. John Locke, who was a rationalist, said, believe in Jesus and lead a moral life. Notice he is not saying necessarily like a spiritually perfect life or a life to glorify God, but lead a moral life. Okay, so some rationalist literature. This guy over here, Thomas Paine, he is one of the big ones. We mentioned him a minute ago. He wrote this thing called Common Sense, which is kind of exactly what you'd think it would be. Most of their literature was devoted to politics, philosophy, ethics, and science. So again, like I said, not the most, like nothing's going to be a huge page turner during this time. This is before we really have like novels and short stories. So most of their literature is what we call didactic, which means it's intended to teach you something, whether it's teaching you how to live, teaching you about politics, teaching you about science. Most of it is didactic literature. There are persuasive essays and pamphlets. Those are very popular around this time. Common Sense was, I believe, a pamphlet. Songs, speeches, and poems, which we will definitely look at some poems over the next couple of days. Letters, also, they didn't mention letters here. Documents such as the Declaration of Independence, that counts as rationalist literature, which bases its arguments on rationalist assumptions about the relations between people, God, and natural law. Reason thrived on freedom of speech, freedom from arbitrary rules. Do we know what arbitrary means? Basically, it's like random, like there's no cause for it. There's no reason really, which we know perfectly well. Plenty of people and plenty of institutions and places have arbitrary rules, but reason kind of thrived on, well, we need a reason to have a rule, so arbitrary rules aren't really going to fly. Freedom to experiment and freedom to question existing laws and institutions. We know perfectly well that the Puritans were really not allowed to question the laws. They had to live strictly by the laws. And when we get to this age of reason, it makes more sense for us to be able to question laws. Why should we blindly follow a law if we don't understand it? So the age of reason in the United States differed from, I don't know why that's in italics, from previous rationalism movements in Europe, namely because American citizens could test new ideas as they created a new society. And that was really a gift, you know, because if you've got a really old country, like England was around long before America was, things are sort of established there. And because we were a baby country at this time, we're able to kind of fashion new ideas and test things out to see what worked for our country. That's pretty cool. Rationalism was about hope. And here's a quote. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce this man's name. Yes, I am. Michel Guillaume Jean de Crevecoeur. That's my best guess. His quote from Letters from an American Farmer. He sounds super American, right? What then is this new man? He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. In America, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men whose labors will one day cause great changes in the world. Boy, that sounds hopeful. It's so hard to feel that way about our country now, in my personal opinion. But I feel like this was the birth of America. Boy, we were just so full of hope. We could do anything. And this is a great quote to kind of sum that up. So that kind of gives you an overview of what we're headed into with rationalism. We're going to look first at some poems by Phyllis Wheatley, who was pretty cool. And then we're actually going to look at some letters from Abigail Adams. Letters were also a big thing, a big part of literature. And Abigail Adams and her husband, John Adams, we should be familiar. They wrote a lot of letters back and forth to each other. And she also wrote letters to her son. I think we're looking at one from her son. We'll find out. But I hope you enjoyed this lovely little presentation and feel a little bit more confident in what rationalism is all about and how it's very different from everything that came before. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to delving into some rationalist literature with you guys.